Do others see something in your life that isn't really there? People ever look in your life and think they see something, spiritual nature, fruit of the Spirit, that upon closer examination of your life is actually absent? Sometimes I believe people present a spiritual mirage, the appearance of something that's not there. In 1906, the famous Arctic explorer Robert Peary was deep inside the Arctic Circle. And there across the blinding white expanse, he looked and he saw the pinnacles of great mountains. He saw deep valleys and grassy meadows. He couldn't believe his eyes to see this in such a desolate, barren Arctic wasteland. He wrote about it, but 7 years later, after he had named this place Crowther Land, Donald McMillan went to search out Crowther Land. There, about 4 days into his journey inside the Arctic Circle, he looked, and there he saw it. Mountains, valleys, and grassy meadows. And one of the most harsh places on planet Earth. He turned to his Eskimo guide and he says, "Chart a course for me directly to this place." And the Eskimo guide began to laugh and said, "Sir, it's not there." So what do you mean it's not there? He said, "It's not there." They come to find out that actually the atmospheric pressure and changes in that place caused this mirage. We think about that, and there are many times in life when we look at someone and it appears that they are a true believer. It appears that there's spiritual fruit, but the busyness with which they engage in spiritual-like activity, it really is just a masquerade for their spiritual barrenness. As we look at our text this morning in Mark chapter 11, in verse 12 and following, what we're going to find is a picture of barren and bankrupt religion. Really, this is what classically scholars call a Markan sandwich. The reason they call it this is because you're going to find this story inside of a story. We're going to read about the cursing of a barren fig tree or a unfruitful fig tree, and inside that story of the fig tree is the more well-known story of Jesus cleansing the temple. And the reason that we call it this Markan sandwich, you have your two pieces of bread, right? The fig tree story, and inside of that you have the cleansing of the temple, and they fit around the story to show us something about the cleansing of the temple. Both stories are complementary, if you will, and they point to the same direction, and that is that Jesus has something to say about a barren and bankrupt religion. Look with me, if you will, Mark chapter 11, beginning in verse 12. Now the next day, when they had come out from Bethany, he was hungry, and seeing from afar a fig tree having leaves, he went to see if perhaps he would find something on it. When he came to see it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. In response, Jesus said to it, "Let no one eat fruit from you ever again." And his disciples heard it. So they came to Jerusalem. And then Jesus went into the temple and began to drive out those who bought and sold in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry wares through the temple. Then he taught, saying to them, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations'? But you have made it a den of thieves." And the scribes and chief priests heard it and sought how they might destroy him, for they feared him, because all the people were astonished at his teaching. When evening had come, he went out of the city. Now in the morning, as they passed by, they saw the fig tree dried up from the roots. And Peter, remembering, said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree which you cursed has withered away." So Jesus answered and said to them, "Have faith in God. For assuredly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, 'Be removed and be cast into the sea,' and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that those things which he says will be done, he will have whatever he says. Therefore I say to you, whatever things you ask when you pray, believe that you receive them, and you will have them. And whenever you stand praying, if you have anything against anyone, forgive him, that your Father in heaven may also forgive you your trespasses. But if you do not forgive, neither will your Father in heaven forgive your trespasses. In Mark chapter 11, we find a picture for us and a story and a lesson for us that Jesus curses the unfruitful, that Jesus curses the unfruitful. On Monday morning, Jesus is leaving the home, most likely of Mary and Martha and Lazarus and Bethany. And you keep in mind that as he's making this 2-mile journey into Jerusalem, that on the previous evening, on Sunday evening, he has entered into Jerusalem triumphantly, as we looked at last week. He's ridden into the city. And now on this morning, as he's walking into the city, he and his disciples, they're coming along the road, and Jesus is hungry. And he's ready to eat some breakfast. And maybe they left very early that morning and didn't stay to eat. And on the way, he becomes hungry. And he looks up on the side of the road, and he sees a fig tree that is full of leaves, and which would indicate that there would be something, at least some green figs that maybe aren't ripened yet, but there's something on the tree. And he goes over, but he found nothing but leaves, verse 13 tells us. Now, it is the very end of March. It is still over a month from the time when the figs would begin to ripen, but still Jesus is expecting to find what we call knops, or unripened figs, very green figs. And you could still eat these, by the way. Whenever a fig tree puts out foliage, it's an indication that it already has the green knops on it. And like I said, you can't eat them. When I was growing up, at some point, I don't know where, but I got a little shoot of a fig tree, and I took it home, and I planted it in our backyard. And this thing, it just grew, and it grew. It was huge, this big, very large kind of bushy tree, and it would get these green figs on it every year. And you could, like I said, when they were first began to they're very small at first, and they're very hard, they're green, they're not very good. And of course, as they continue to grow, they turn brown and they get more mushy, and they're pretty delicious then. But I had a golden retriever. I never really liked figs a whole lot, but we had this golden retriever, and he loved those figs, even when they were green. You'd pull them off and you'd throw them, and the dog would jump and catch a fig in the air. And but I think about what he's talking about here is he sees the foliage that's been put out, and he realizes that there should be these green, unripened figs that you can't eat on them. And he goes over, and it has all the signs of fruit, the leaves, but no actual fruit. In a way, I believe what Jesus does is he curses this, is he points to the fact that he's about to do something in Jerusalem. And obviously this is a real story. I mean, Jesus was hungry. He went over in his human knowledge to see if there was anything there. There was not. But he uses this as a teaching lesson, because there are times we find that there are some things that have to be said, and words are not enough. Words are not enough, that a prophet would have to do something, a symbolic act to show a greater and more important lesson. For example, the prophet Ahijah, when he saw Jeroboam coming down the road, he took his garment and he tore it into 12 pieces. And he gave Jeroboam, the future king of the northern kingdom, he gave him 10 of those pieces to represent 10 of those tribes, and he kept 2 of the pieces of cloth for himself to show an object lesson. And here Jesus is showing an object lesson for his disciples in cursing the fig tree that points ultimately to what he's going to do in the temple, because Israel is often in the prophets represented as a fig tree. And Jesus is showing that they have lots of religious activity symbolized by the leaves, but they have no actual fruit. It's a reminder to us that we have to produce spiritual fruit, and Jesus curses the unfruitful. And that means that he desires fruit. As you look in verses 12 and 13, you find that he's physically hungry. He physically desires fruit. And he goes over to get some fruit, and he finds none. In the same way, Jesus desires from every one of you, he desires from every person, he desires from every Christian spiritual fruit. In John chapter 15, he makes this expressly clear. He says that by this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit. See, it's God's will that you bear fruit, that you will be my disciples. And when we fail to bear fruit, it does not glorify God, and it leads to disappointment in us. Now, we don't all bear the same amount of fruit, but every believer bears fruit. Not every Christian bears the same amount of fruit, just as every tree doesn't bear the same amount of fruit. But if you are a child of God, you will produce fruit. Now, what kind of fruit am I talking about? I'm talking about the fruit of the Spirit. We know in Galatians chapter 5, there are those 9 characteristics, those 9 virtues, those 9 evidences that a person is born again. They're called the fruit of the Spirit because if you have the Spirit of God in your life, you're going to produce those spiritual fruits. And Jesus said, by their fruits you shall know them. Jesus desires a fruitfulness in your life. But he's disappointed by fruitlessness as well. When you do not produce spiritual fruit in your life, it is disappointing in the sight of God. We know that very clearly that Jesus has made it clear that he desires this fruit, and he wants us to produce that fruit in our life. I'm afraid that many times people try to cover up the fact that they don't have spiritual fruit. You may not be aware of it. And often you've deceived yourself because you have allowed your busyness to cover up your barrenness. You've allowed the busyness with which you're taking and engaging in church-like and Christian-like activities to cover up the fact that you're actually barren spiritually. And like I said, there's no such thing as a barren believer, but John MacArthur once said, we confuse success, sensationalism, and simulation for fruitfulness. And I think that's a great way to put it. We often confuse success, simulation, and sensationalism with spiritual fruit. But that's not true. We actually have to understand that if those things are not legitimate fruit, and you cannot deny the fact when you look in your life whether or not you are producing the fruit of the Spirit. You can lie to yourself all day long, but look at your life and take a good, hard look, and either the fruit is there or it's not there. Because Jesus desires fruitfulness. He's disappointed by fruitlessness. But finally, Jesus, he damns fruitlessness. In verse 14, you see that Jesus curses the fig tree. Now, I think a lot of people have difficulty with this because most of the time, Jesus is performing miracles of blessing, and he could certainly have caused this tree to produce fruit immediately if he had so desired. There aren't many examples of Jesus performing a destructive miracle. This and perhaps the casting of the demons into the swine when they went into the Sea of Galilee are the only two that we have in the Scriptures where Jesus is destroying something. But we have to separate Jesus' attitude here from his act. His attitude is one of heartbreak for the people of Israel. He has an attitude of heartbreak when we don't produce fruit. But the attitude and the act are different because his act is to condemn fruitlessness when he sees it. Now, it doesn't mean he's ultimately just cursing this tree, but he's also ultimately making it clear that it's going to become what it already is. He's just hastening or speeding up the process of its death because it's not producing anything. It is barren. It is dried up from the roots. He just makes it occur faster. And in the same way, when he sees that there is a life that's not producing fruit, that's dried up from the roots, that has no root in Christ, he ultimately condemns it to be exactly what it already is. And that life will be destroyed. The reason Jesus curses this tree, and the reason that Jesus curses all who are ultimately hypocrites and not truly born again, is because of the fact that he condemns anytime there is a profession of faith without the performance of faith. If you want to know if you're a true believer, then you will produce fruit. It's one thing to have a profession of faith, but do you actually produce fruit? And so this tree is saying, it's making a statement on the side of the road in the springtime with all these leaves. It's saying, I've got fruit. But when you go and look at it, there's none there. Do you try to say, I've got fruit, I'm a believer, and when people look at your life, there's actually no evidence? I think most people who are even remotely religious have a lot of leaves in their life. But there's no actual fruit. And so many Christians have this outward appearance of spirituality, but no inward substance. And there are many churches that are made up of people just like this, and churches that are the same way as these individuals. They have an outward busyness. They have leaves, but they have no fruit. I served at a church one time, and somebody told me of one of the pastors who had served there. They said, David, he preached here for 10 years, but no one was ever saved because there was no gospel and there was no God in his preaching. There are many churches that preach a social gospel today rather than a saving gospel. And there are churches today that have thousands in attendance, but no one ever gets saved because the gospel is absent. There are leaves, but there is no fruit. And you show me a church with a dry and a dusty baptistry, and I'll show you a church where the gospel of Jesus Christ is not being proclaimed. We have to look and understand there is evidence of fruitfulness. Many people have been confused because of inauthentic credentials. I heard this week about a man who in the early 1980s was teaching engineering at George Washington University under the name of Dr. Crowther. But some 70 miles away at Miltonville State College, he was known as Dr. Pierce, where he was teaching economics. Another 45 minutes away at Shippensburg State College, he was teaching mathematics under the name of Dr. Hext. When they finally found out about him and the FBI went to arrest him, as he locked up his office, they simply wrote on his warrant, Dr. John Doe. It turned out that he had 34 false identities. He lived in 3 apartments and had applied to teach at over 55 universities, many of which had already hired him, and he hadn't even showed up to work yet. And here was a man who fooled even the smartest people. The people that had hired him, the colleges and the universities, had no idea. But despite all his credentials, it was false. And there are many people who have many credentials. They say, well, I've been baptized. I'm a member of the church. I have served as a Sunday school teacher and as a deacon. I've perhaps been a pastor. But they have never been saved. They have no legitimate fruit. We have to ask ourselves as our church, even as we look at our church, are we bearing fruit? Are we funding missions? Are we giving to do the work of ministry? And even in your personal life, here's the famous question that's been asked many times. If you were arrested for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? The harsh reality of this story is that fruitlessness today might result in fruitlessness forever. Because Jesus curses the unfruitful. And if you do not produce fruit today, there is the possibility that you will never, ever in your life produce fruit, and you will die, and you will go to hell. You'll be like the tree that's been cut down and thrown into the fire because you failed to produce fruit. Jesus curses the unfruitful, and he casts out the unscrupulous. As we look at the rest of the passage here, it's clear that unfruitfulness leads to unscrupulousness. Just because you profess something doesn't mean you possess something. We go and find here that there is the perversion of God's house. Now, what happened to the fig tree was just a preview of what's going to happen on that momentous Monday when Jesus walks into the temple and he sees people buying and selling and exchanging money, and he begins to turn over tables and he begins to drive people out of the temple. Because God came and he cleaned house on that day. Because he saw what was going on. He saw that they were just as barren as the fig tree. Now, Jesus enters this enormous temple complex. This is Israel's, you'll hear it referred to as the Second Temple period. It was really the Third Temple because the Second Temple, built by Zerubbabel in about 515 BC, has now begun to go renovations. That Herod the Great began to do the Second Temple in about 20 BC, and most likely he built a new temple on the foundation of the old one and expanded it considerably. It took about 80 years to complete the temple. It was still under construction in Jesus' day, and it continued to be developed until about 4 years before it was ultimately destroyed in AD 70. Now, this is an enormous complex. You have the Court of the Gentiles, which is the largest area. It's the outward courtyard. And by the way, it covers 35 acres. This is an enormous area. Now, I thought when I came the first time here to Immanuel, I thought this was one of the biggest churches, I think, building-wise, I'd ever seen. I mean, our building alone is over 200,000 square feet, basically covering 2 city blocks. And as large as our church is, let me give you an idea how big the temple was. If you took our building and you multiplied it by 8, that would be the footprint of the court of the Gentiles. I mean, this is huge, 35 acres. And there, as they go into this incredible building, with all of this religious activity, sacrifices, and busyness taking place, it's a reminder that not everything that glitters is gold. And buildings and budgets cannot masquerade as simple blessing. Jesus goes in and he sees what's happening there, and you really want to know what this was all about. I mean, you have basically the temple functioning as the national bank and the stockyard rolled into one. I mean, there are two activities that are going on here. He talks about the money changers and those who are selling these doves. And so at the first level, you have the money changers. Now, according to Exodus chapter 30, every male over 30 years old, when they would arrive at the temple, they had to pay, annually, they had to pay a half shekel tax. And that tax was for the upkeep and the administration, the ministry of the temple. But when you arrived there, and by the way, there were Jews coming from all over the known world. They were coming from Rome and Greece and Asia Minor and all these different places. And when they arrived at the temple and to pay this half shekel tax, they could not pay it with just any kind of coinage. Because on those coins that were Roman and Greek, there would very often be an image which was not allowed into the temple. Even, for example, if you took a quarter, you could not give that in the temple because it has the image of a person, and you shall not make any likeness of anything in heaven above or on earth beneath or earth below. So you have this stipulation which you can't have an image of any living being on the coin, and so they couldn't have a false god or have an emperor's face, so they would have to exchange it for a Tyrian coinage, and they could do that there in the temple. The money changers were there so they could give you the right kind of currency that you could give your money in the temple. Now, of course, that came with a little bit of a fee, about 4 to 10% interest on those kinds of transactions. On top of that, you also have the selling of sacrificial animals. Again, because people are traveling a long way to be there, you can't bring your bull or your goat with you. You have to just bring yourself, and you buy the animal once you get there, for those who live further away. And so you have these people who are selling sacrificial animals. It wasn't necessarily wrong to sell sacrificial animals because they had to get it somewhere, but to do this in the court of the Gentiles is where the problem comes in. And see, what we find here is that these people were using the temple as a way of ripping people off and a way of distracting and taking away the main purpose of the temple, which was worship, to focus on business deals. And so all of this shows us that the perversion of God's house, and Jesus Christ will have none of it. I've wondered for many years, and as I've grown up, wondering what on earth is the application for today. I mean, does this mean we can't buy or sell in the church? And pretty much growing up as a Southern Baptist kid in South Carolina, I always thought that the main application is that when a Southern Gospel quartet came on Sunday night, that they couldn't sell a CD in the vestibule. And if you saw them, you needed to take a whip of cords and drive them out. Get back on that Silver Eagle and get out of here, you know. Or perhaps we can't put up with a cake and pie auction in the fellowship hall. But as we look at this, and by the way, I'm not a real big fan of selling things at church, but I don't think that's the primary takeaway for us. I think the main application of this for us is to remember that we can never allow anything in the church to take the place of the worship of God, and we can never allow the church to be a place where we try to fleece people. By the way, it's been done many, many times. Hey, it's one thing to talk about giving money to the support and the ministry of the Lord, which that needs to be preached, that needs to be done. But trying to fleece people and trick people and be a huckster to take money from people who don't have any money to begin with is a serious crime against God and against other human beings. And we've seen it from the very beginning, from the selling of indulgences by the Catholic Church, saying if you just give this money, when a coin in the copper rings, a soul from purgatory springs. And these kind of ideas that you give money to have spiritual blessing for yourself or your family. It's been handed down in the form of the prosperity gospel, where people stand on television and say, hey, if you just send me a donation, I'll send you a prayer cloth. But I'm afraid it's been done in many other ways as well, when people try to push people aside from the church, and people try to say, well, you give this money for the work of ministry, but it's going to be spent on exorbitant and luxurious living and incredible salaries. This is sort of the things that are common today in the American church. And we can never allow anything else to take the place of the worship of our almighty, omnipotent God. And we can never allow our own agenda to push other people aside, because what they were doing is, by pushing aside the poor, is they were making this is a place where people could not come and worship and focus on worship, and they were to be a house of prayer for all nations. Do we show that we care about other people in the church? Do we make sure that we are emphasizing the need for the poor and the other and others to come into our church and to hear the gospel? We can't allow anything to take place in the worship of God. We cannot allow the worship of God to become a performance rather than participating of the people of God. There's the perversion of God's house. There's the purpose of God's house, because Jesus says very clearly, my house is to be called a house of prayer for all nations. The one place where Gentiles, where the nations could come and worship God, they were being distracted by all the coming and going of these merchants. And he says, you have turned the house of prayer into a den of robbers. In other words, he's saying you are a place where you are taking what's not even rightfully yours, and you're hoarding it up like highway robbers would hide their stolen goods in a cave. Are we coming to the place in our lives where we are pretending to be one thing, but it's just a cover-up? And our religious activity is just a cover-up of hypocrisy? We have to keep the focus on worshiping God. And that means that anything in our life, any unethical behavior in our life, cannot be used to masquerade insincerity. And we have to make sure that in our bodies, which are temples of the Holy Spirit, that we keep them clean so that we can worship God properly. Because when we do not, God cleans house. I heard about some college boys who wanted to adopt the school mascot, which was a goat. But they didn't have a place to keep it. So one of them said, where can we keep it? They said, well, we can keep it in our room. One of them said, well, what about the smell? They said, well, the goat will get used to it. There are some people who live like that. But in our lives, we cannot live like that, because we're not called to push God out. God will not move out, but he's not going to live in a dirty house. And God will clean house when we have that kind of attitude. So Jesus curses the unfruitful. He casts out the unscrupulous, but he also challenges the uncertain. In verse 20, we find that the story about the fruitless fig tree can provide some fruitful reflection. As we look more and see what Jesus has said here, we understand that when Jesus cursed the fig tree, it was a symbol of his cursing of the temple, and the temple also dried up from the roots. It was already dried up spiritually, but in about 30 years after he says this, in AD 70, the Romans destroyed the temple, and it has never been rebuilt. And all of that pointed to the fact that God was doing something. And while he was saying that this temple, this place where the nation should be able to come and to hear about God, the nation should be able to come and worship, it's going to be destroyed. But he's saying, remember in John chapter 2, that I am the temple. And Jesus Christ would replace the temple, and we are to gather and to worship him. And as Christians, we are still to be people of prayer. That's not going to change when the temple is destroyed. In order to be effectively reaching people, instead of being masquerading with hypocrisy, and instead of fleecing people and turning people away, we are to turn the nations to God, and we do that through our prayer life. We do that by exercising faith in prayer and by offering forgiveness to others so that we can have effective prayer. So Jesus makes a challenge to those who are uncertain. He makes a challenge to faith. Notice there in verse 22, he says, have faith in God. This is a clear command and a challenge to faith. In other words, he's saying that when something seems impossible, that we need to place our faith in an almighty, omnipotent, all-controlling, sovereign God and trust him to do what only he can do, that he can turn impossible situations into possibilities, so that he can move the mountains of impossibility from your life. There are going to be times, and even as we look around today and we think about what we're experiencing as a nation and as Christians, we realize that there are seemingly impossible odds against us, that everything is seeming to go from bad to worse, and we have crushing opposition. But when we bow our knees in prayer to God, God can make the impossible possible. Do you believe that? I mean, we look back through history and see how the power of prayer and the all-powerful God has changed the course of human history. When an Islamic army swept through North Africa and Spain and began to invade Gaul, or modern France, they were wiping everything and everyone in their path from the face of the earth. And there in the 8th century, nothing was there to stop them from taking all of Europe except Charles Martel and his ragtag army that was outnumbered 5-1. But in 732, at Porlois, France, he led that army in prayer, and they won an impossible victory that changed the course in the face of Western civilization. In 1588, the Spanish Armada, the largest naval force that ever set sail, was headed to invade England. And the British people prayed to God, and the Spanish Armada was wiped from the face of the earth. On December the 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked at Pearl Harbor, do you realize that the only thing that we had defending the seaports along the coast of California was some balloons, more than 200 feet of cable? And what kept the Japanese from invading our west coast? I believe that what made the difference is at that time in our nation's history, our nation humbled ourselves before God, and we got on our knees and we asked God for his hand of providence and protection in our nation, and God answered that prayer. I want you to know that throughout history, when God's people have prayed, God has done the seemingly impossible. And I believe that today we need to have that kind of mountain-moving faith. We need to be the kind of people who come before God and pray for spiritual awakening. We need to be the people who are praying for lost people. We need to be praying for wayward children. We need to be praying for those in authority. We need to be praying for God to meet needs and for his hand of protection and providence. We need to pray for this God to help us as this church to reach the nations. When we're uncertain, he says there's some certainty that we can have power by praying to an all-powerful God. And that means that we have to exercise faith. We have to answer the challenge to faith. But also that means, I believe, to have an effective prayer life and to be the effective people of God in this world, rather than a bankrupt and barren place, that we have to exercise not only faith, but we must exercise forgiveness. Find in verse 25, and you stand praying if you have anything against anyone. By the way, that's pretty general. Anything against anyone, forgive him, that your Father in heaven may also forgive you. Forgiveness is the prerequisite for effective prayer. Remember in Matthew chapter 18, there was the parable of the unforgiving servant. Do I have to remind you? God forgave this man so much, and yet he refused to forgive others who owed him so much less. Do you remember how it went for that man? It didn't go well. Do you remember what Jesus said when he talked about offering your gift at the altar, and you suddenly remember that you have something against your brother, or your brother has something against you? Do you remember that in the model prayer, or the Lord's Prayer, that Jesus said, forgive us as we forgive our debtors? It doesn't matter if the offense is between you and an unbeliever or between you and another believer. It doesn't matter if it's a serious sin or offense or if it's just a minor matter that's in your mind. We are called to forgive those, whether rich or poor, whether friend or foe, whether relative or acquaintance, whether Democrat or Republican. We are called to forgive everyone. We must forgive. And it doesn't mean that you can forget. People say, I can forgive, but I can't forget. Well, God doesn't ask you to forget. He just asks you to forgive. You can't always forget what's taken place, but you can forsake the grudge. Don't let anything come between you and God. When something comes between you and another person, it's not just between you and that person. It comes between you and God. If we're going to be the people of God, who are not going to be barren, bankrupt, we've got to be people who are faithful. Got to be people who are faithful to God. That means that we pray for others. We pray that God would establish our mission in the world, and that comes when we exercise forgiveness and when we exercise faith. I realize that it's a challenge when we talk about bearing fruit, because there are two ways that we often respond. You know, you sit there and you look at your life today and you think, well, I'm not producing a whole lot of fruit. And you might be tempted to do one of two things. On one hand, you might think, well, I need to avoid certain kinds of behavior. So if I'm going to produce fruit, I've got to start avoiding doing these things that I shouldn't be doing. And so I'm trying to avoid all these things to produce fruit. Or on the other hand, you say, I'm going to start trying to adhere to all these behaviors, these positives. Instead of avoiding the negatives, I'm going to adhere to the positive list of do's. And then I'll produce fruit. Listen, you're going to wear yourself out if you start thinking that your ability to produce fruit is dependent upon your avoidance or your adherence. You know what Jesus said, how you produce fruit? Abide. He said, abide in me, and you will produce much fruit. Maybe you're here today and you've never committed your life to Jesus Christ. If you've never committed your life to Christ, you're never going to produce fruit. I want to encourage you in just a moment that you come down as we sing this hymn of invitation. I'm going to be standing here at the front, and you come and say, David, I want to abide in Christ. I want to give my life to Christ, and God will produce fruit in your life. Maybe you're here today and you say, I know that I'm a believer, but I haven't been producing much fruit. You know, sometimes the issue is lack of salvation because we don't have the right root. But other times you have the right root, but there are a lot of Christians who are spraying pesticide in their life because there are sins in your life that can keep you from producing the fruit that you need to be producing. Maybe you need to lay that sin on the altar this morning and ask God to bless you with increased fruitfulness. Maybe you're here this morning and you say, I want to be connected and planted alongside other believers so that I can produce more fruit and use the fruit of the Spirit to serve the church. Whatever God is calling you to do this morning, as we have this time of invitation, you come and you be obedient to produce the fruit that God will produce in you.